Hello, friends, and welcome to a fantastic science fiction story. In this episode, I'll be telling you the story of Carter and Mila. Grab your coffee, sit back, and enjoy the show. I was helping the alien woman put on her armor when she suddenly burst out laughing and said, "Your touch feels so nice." On the frontier world of Thorne, where the sky was the color of a bruise that couldn't decide whether to heal, there stood a machine that nobody had built and everybody was willing to die for. They called it the Thorne Gate. A ring of black metal wider than a cathedral, half buried in the plain like a coin dropped by a god with careless pockets, humming a note so low you felt it in your teeth before you heard it in your ears. It was older than the war. Older, some said, than humanity's habit of picking fights it couldn't win, which was saying something, because that habit was very old indeed. What was certain was this: whatever came through the gate next would decide who owned the sky over Thorne. And possibly the sky over a great many other places too. So the legions came, and the Vaskari came, and they stood shoulder to golden shoulder in the mud, two species who agreed on almost nothing except the urgent shared conviction that dying together was marginally better than dying alone. Carter was not, strictly speaking, dying. He was polishing boots. This was a distinction he clung to with the fervor of a man clinging to a raft, because in the camp's rigid and unforgiving hierarchy, not currently dying was about as high as a squire could reasonably aspire. He was 17, or possibly 18. The paperwork had been lost when the requisition tent flooded, and Carter had chosen the higher number on the grounds that it sounded braver. He had a face that looked perpetually apologetic even when he'd done nothing wrong, which in the army was often, and hands that were surprisingly clever at the small, careful work nobody else could be bothered to do. He polished boots he was not permitted to wear. He mended straps he would never buckle. He had, on one memorable occasion, been trusted to carry a message across camp, and had delivered it with such trembling gravity that the recipient assumed the war was lost. It had not been. The message was about porridge. The camp ran on porridge, rumor, and superstition in roughly that order. And of all the superstitions the soldiers cherished, don't sharpen a blade after dark, don't count the drones before a sortie, don't ever ask the quartermaster where the second shipment of boots actually went, the most sacred, the most inviolable, the one whispered to every green recruit on their first shivering night, was this: never, under any circumstances, touch the Vaskari commander. Her name was Mila. Carter had seen her exactly 4 times, always from the safe distance one keeps from a wildfire one admires. She was tall and golden-skinned, her long ears sweeping back from her head like the fins of some elegant deep-sea thing, and she moved through the chaos of the camp, the way a knife moves through the idea of resistance. She fought alone. She camped alone. She ate alone, when she ate at all, which was a matter of some debate among the cooks, who took it personally, and she spoke to no one, not her own soldiers, not the human generals, not the birds, who had wisely relocated. The stories about her multiplied in the dark like mushrooms. She had killed a man for tapping her shoulder, they said. Broken his wrist, at least. Possibly both wrists, in a version of the story told by a soldier who had never met her and was working entirely from atmosphere. She was cursed. She was blessed. She was, according to the cook, no way to treat good porridge. Carter believed roughly 1/3 of it, which he considered admirably skeptical, right up until the morning the armoring duty came around. Before a battle, someone had to buckle the commander into her armor. Vaskari warplate was a monstrous, layered, buckle-infested puzzle box of a thing, and it could not, by its own perverse design, be donned alone. Somebody had to do it. And so, in a tent that smelled of oil and dread, the squires gathered around a helmet to draw straws, an event undertaken with all the giddy enthusiasm of men defusing a bomb while blindfolded and being shouted at. "I'll trade my straw for your dinner," muttered a squire named Dylan, who was pale as milk. "You'll trade your straw for my dinner and my grandmother's grave," said another. "Whoever gets short is a dead man, and dead men don't need grandmothers." "That's not how grandmothers work," Carter offered. Nobody was listening. Hands plunged in. Straws came out. There was a collective, held-breath silence. the particular silence of many people simultaneously deciding not to be the unlucky one. And then, slowly, every eye in the tent turned toward Carter, who was standing there holding the shortest straw he had ever seen, a straw so short it barely qualified as a decision, staring at it with the dawning expression of a man who has just read the punchline to his own funeral. "Well," said Dylan, with the tender solemnity one reserves for the recently condemned, "it's been an honor. Sort of. Not really." Carter looked at the straw. He looked at the tent flap. Beyond it, out in the gray morning, the black ring of the Thorne gate hummed its endless subterranean note, and somewhere within the Golden Warrior's tent, the most touchable subject in the entire war was waiting to be very carefully not touched. He squared his narrow shoulders, rehearsed his own eulogy, short, dignified, mostly about porridge, and lifted the flap. The tent was smaller inside than Dread had led him to expect. Dread always oversells the venue. There was a cot no one had slept in, a rack of weapons arranged with the loving precision of a woman who trusted steel more than company, and a single lamp burning a cold blue Vaskari flame that threw everything into sharp, honest relief. And there, standing in the center of it all with her back to him, was Mila. She was already half into the underlayer, the black mesh that went beneath the plate, and above its collar Carter could see the golden skin of her neck and shoulders, and the scars. He had not been prepared for the scars. Pale seams crossed her back and sides like the dry beds of rivers on a map of some drought-stricken country, silver against gold, old and healed and everywhere. They told a story he couldn't read, in a language of survival he was grateful never to have learned. "You're not Dylan," she said, without turning around. Her voice was low and even, the voice of someone who had long ago stopped expecting conversation to go anywhere pleasant. "No," Carter agreed. Then, because his mouth had a habit of continuing without executive approval. "Dylan traded his straw for his grandmother's grave. It's a whole situation. I lost. I won. I lost the drawing, but I won the honor of this." He gestured at the armor rack, realized she couldn't see him gesturing, and lowered his hand as though it had betrayed him. There was a silence. It was not, he noticed, a wrist-breaking silence. It was merely a silence. "The plate," she said, "goes on in order. Spine first, then ribs, then shoulders. If you drop the spine piece, I will not break your wrist, whatever they told you. It's too heavy. I'd have to break something lighter." Carter laughed before he could stop himself, a short, undignified honk of surprise, and clapped a hand over his own mouth as though he might catch it and put it back. Sorry. I didn't think you'd... They said you didn't. Talk, I know." She lifted the great curved spine piece from the rack and held it out, still not looking at him. "I'm making an exception. You may thank the porridge." So he began. The spine piece first, exactly as she'd said, heavy as guilt and twice as awkward, settling against the mesh with a soft mechanical sigh as its old alien clasps found their homes. His hands worked the fastenings at the small of her back, careful, deliberate, the way he was careful and deliberate about everything small that nobody else could be bothered to do well. She stood rigid, braced. Her whole body held the particular stillness of someone waiting for pain, and it made his chest ache in a way he didn't have a word for, so he simply worked, buckle by buckle, up the ribs, easing the plates against her sides. He fastened a strap along her flank, drawing it snug, his fingertips brushing the warm gold of her skin just above one of the pale scars. And Mila laughed. It came out of her bright and startled and entirely unguarded, a sound so unlike anything the war had ever heard from her that Carter froze with his hands still resting at her side, certain he had broken something after all. But it wasn't pain. It was the opposite of pain. She had turned her head and he could see the edge of her face, and the fierce commander was simply gone, briefly and completely, replaced by someone younger, someone softer, someone who looked almost as astonished as he was. "Your touch," she said, and there was wonder in it, small and helpless. "It feels so nice." Carter's brain performed several complicated maneuvers and arrived nowhere. Thank you? Is that good? That's good, right? That's not a dual thing? It's not a dual thing. She was still half-turned, still looking at him, and now the wonder was tempered with a rueful, unfamiliar warmth. You don't understand. Of course you don't. How would you? She drew a breath, and the confession came out of her the way water comes through a crack. Slowly, then all at once. My people feel through the skin. Not just pressure, heat, the things you feel. We feel intent. When someone touches us, we know what's behind it. Kindness, anger, fear, greed. It comes through the hands like a voice. A stranger's touch is unbearable. It's all their want, shouting at once. So we don't. We keep apart. That sounds, Carter said honestly, exhausting. It is. Something flickered at the corner of her mouth. But the scars. She reached back, brushed one of the silver seams with her own fingers, and her face closed a fraction. The scars are dead. They feel nothing. And there are so many of them now that most of me has gone quiet. Years, I've walked around inside a body that mostly can't listen anymore. When people reach for me, I flinch. Not from them, from the silence, from the parts of me that can't answer. She looked at her own scarred hand as though it belonged to someone else. I stopped letting anyone try. It was easier to be the monster in the stories. Carter stood very still, his hands hovering, unsure whether he was permitted to keep going. But your hands found the places that are still awake, she said quietly. And there was no want in them, only care. I had forgotten what that felt like. I had forgotten it existed. Outside, faint and rising, the war horns began to sound. Neither of them moved. For one strange, suspended moment inside the blue-lit tent, the untouchable warrior and the boy who polished boots he couldn't wear simply stood there, caught in the impossible discovery that she had, after all, wanted to be touched gently by someone, and that someone, of all the unlikely people in all the war, was him. Then the horn sharpened. Mila straightened, and the commander flowed back into her like a tide returning to a familiar shore. "Finish the shoulders, squire," she said, but the softness had not entirely gone from her voice. "We have a gate to hold." The plain before the Thorne gate had been many things in its long life. A seabed, a graveyard, a nursery for the black machine that slept beneath it. But on this particular gray morning, it decided to become the loudest place in the galaxy. The war horns had barely finished their throats before the sky answered, and what the sky said was not encouraging. Gun drones rose in shrieking clouds from both lines, human and Vaskari craft weaving together in patterns worked out over months of grudging cooperation, and beneath them, the great ring of the gate began, without anyone's permission, to glow. "That's new," Carter observed, from behind Mila, where he had positioned himself according to a philosophy he privately called tactical proximity to the person least likely to die. "Is it supposed to do that? The glowing?" "No," said Mila. "Ah, great, cozy." The gate's inner surface was lighting up ring by ring, veins of pale fire chasing each other around its impossible circumference. And the low tooth-humming note it always made had climbed into something that felt less like sound, and more like a warning shouted directly into the marrow. And then, across the plain, the horizon itself seemed to lean forward and pour. The Vess had arrived. Carter had heard them described 100 times in 100 terrified whispers, and none of it had prepared him. They were not an army. Armies had faces, however unpleasant. The Vess were a tide, a single hive-minded machine intelligence wearing 10,000 bodies at once, chittering black and silver things that flowed over the ground with the awful coordination of a spilled liquid deciding to hate you. They ate worlds. That was the whole of their ambition. They came. They dismantled everything down to its usable atoms. They filed the remains into tidy geometric stacks. And they moved on, leaving behind planets scraped so clean they looked apologetic. There was no bargaining with the tide. You could only be somewhere the tide was not. "Right," said Carter faintly. "So the plan is—" "Hold the line," said Mila, and drew both blades. What happened next? Carter would spend the rest of his life failing to describe properly, mostly because he spent most of it hiding behind her. Mila went into the vest like a golden storm given permission. She did not fight the way the human soldiers fought, in the grim shoving press of the shield wall. She fought the way weather happens, everywhere at once and utterly without apology, her long ears flat against her skull, her scarred body flowing through the chaos in a language of violence so fluent it looked like a conversation the enemy kept losing. Around her, the line held. Because of her, mostly. Carter contributed in the only way available to a man of his particular gifts, which was by talking. "On your left!" he shrieked, and Mila's left blade removed the thing on her left. "Other left, sorry. That one. The one with the extra legs. Why does it have extra legs? That's greedy." He ducked as something screamed overhead and detonated against a drone. "You know what I've noticed about the Vess? Terrible personalities. No small talk, just relentless ambition. Very corporate." A Vess construct lunged at him and he hit it, quite by accident, with a spanner he'd forgotten he was holding, and it fell over in a way that surprised them both. "Did you see that? I did a violence. I'd like that noted in my file, assuming the file survives, assuming I survive, assuming—" "Squire," said Mila without breaking rhythm. "You talk when you're frightened. I talk when I'm alive. It's just louder when I'm frightened." And then the gate screamed. It was not a sound a thing that size should have been able to make. The glowing veins along its inner ring flared white all at once, and a wall of raw, unshaped energy tore loose from the structure, not aimed, not fired, simply released, as though the machine had flinched. It rolled across the plain in a bright, silent wave, and where it passed, the Vess tide came apart into drifting geometry, and the human lines staggered, and the world went the specific violent color of the inside of Carter's own eyelids. He felt the ground leave him. There was a wrenching, sideways, wrong sort of motion, the sensation of being picked up by a hand made of light and set down somewhere it had no business setting him, and a roaring, and then, abruptly, silence. Real silence. The kind that has weight. Carter opened his eyes to darkness lit only by faint pulses of cold blue running through the walls. He was lying on a smooth, black floor that curved up into shadow on every side. He was bruised in places he hadn't packed, and there was a golden hand gripping his collar, and Mila's face above him, dust-streaked and grim, one long ear notched fresh at the tip. "You're alive," she said. It was not quite a question. "Debatable," Carter croaked. Where are we? Where's the line? Where's the army?" "Gone." She hauled him upright with unsettling ease and looked around at the vast, humming, blue-veined dark that enclosed them on every side, a place no living thing was ever meant to stand. "The surge threw us through. We're on the wrong side of the gate, Squire." Her jaw tightened. "Inside it." Carter's calm crackled once in his ear, coughed up a mouthful of static, and died. Somewhere far above and impossibly far away, muffled to nothing by meters of alien metal, the battle he could no longer reach went on without him. "Well," he said into the enormous dark, "at least it stopped glowing." The inside of the Thorne gate did not believe in floors exactly. It believed in surfaces, which was a subtler and more upsetting thing. The two of them picked their way through a cavernous underworld of black struts and slow, pulsing veins, along walkways that curved up walls and became ceilings without warning, so that Carter's stomach spent much of the journey filing formal complaints. Gravity here was a matter of opinion, and the gate's opinion changed often. "I've decided something," Carter announced, edging along a ledge that had until recently been a wall. "I don't like it in here." "Noted. I'd like to lodge that with someone. Is there a suggestions box? A complaints tide? Do the Vess do customer service?" "If they did," said Mila, testing the next span with the point of a blade, "you'd be on hold." Carter stopped edging. Did you just make a joke?" "I make several a year," she said without turning around. "You've caught me at a generous time." They went on, and a strange thing happened as they went. which was that the enormous dread of the place began, very slowly, to make room for something else. It's hard to stay properly terrified next to a person for hours. Terror is exhausting and demands variety. So they talked, or rather Carter talked, in his usual undammable stream, and Mila, to his ongoing amazement, talked back. Her wit turned out to be a dry, clipped, deadpan thing that arrived so quietly he kept missing it and then laughing 3 seconds late, like thunder catching up to lightning. She had spent years, he realized, being funny to absolutely no one. It was a terrible waste. It was like discovering someone had been keeping a magnificent garden locked behind a wall and calling it a fortress. They crossed a chasm of humming blue on a strut no wider than a plank, Carter clinging to the back of her armor and narrating his own bravery in a voice that shook. They squeezed through a gap where the gate's ancient machinery pressed close and hot, and something enormous turned over in the dark below them, older than the war, minding its own business, thank goodness. And in the quieter stretches, in the long climbs upward toward wherever up had gone, she began, carefully, the way you test ice, to tell him the truth of the scars. There was a world called Aveth, she said. Her voice had gone flat and far away, the voice people use for the memories they've handled so many times the edges have worn smooth. The Ves came for it. I was young. I had people. My unit. We'd grown up together, trained together. Vaskari bond through the skin, I told you that. Touch is how we say the things there are no words for. We were closer than your kind can easily imagine. She placed a hand on the wall, guiding herself along it, and did not look at him. The line broke. There was fire, a chemical fire. It stuck to the plate, to the skin. I pulled them out. All of them. It didn't matter. They died anyway in my hands, and I felt every one of them go. Felt the fear, then the pain, then the nothing coming through my skin, one after another, until I couldn't tell where they ended and I began. Carter had stopped talking. This, for him, was a form of prayer. The fire took the feeling with it, Mila went on. Where it burned, the skin went dead, and I found afterward that I was glad. Do you understand? I was glad the numbness had come, because if I couldn't feel, then I could never feel that again, never hold anyone while they left. So I let the scars grow. I stopped healing them properly. I picked the fights that would leave more of them. I built myself out of dead skin on purpose, so that nothing could ever reach me again. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. It worked. That's the joke. It worked perfectly. I stopped grieving because I stopped touching, and I stopped touching because grieving is what touching had become. And then I looked up one day and I was the monster in the stories, and I had done it to myself, buckle by buckle. They came to a place where the walkway simply ended in a ledge over dark, and Mila stood at the edge of it looking at nothing. You didn't have to tell me that, Carter said quietly. No, she agreed. I didn't. He didn't try to fix it. He had a strong suspicion it wasn't the kind of thing that got fixed, only carried, and that the offer to help carry mattered more than any clever thing he could say. So instead, when the ledge proved too high for him to climb after her, and she turned and reached down without thinking, he took her offered hand, her scarred hand, the numb one, the one that couldn't feel him at all, and let her haul him up. And when he was up, standing beside her on the ledge with his heart going like a drum, he didn't let go right away. He just held it a moment longer than strictly necessary. A hand offered at a height, a shoulder braced without asking anything back. Mila looked at their joined hands. Then she looked at him, and something in her face had come loose that had been fastened tight for a very long time. I can't feel that, she said. This hand. It's dead. You know that. I know, said Carter. I'm not doing it so you'll feel it. I'm doing it so I will. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, very carefully, she moved his hand, up to the inside of her wrist, where a narrow band of gold ran unscarred between the silver seams, a place that was still awake. There, she said softly. Do it there. Far above them, through the humming dark, A new light had begun to pulse at the top of the long climb, the core of the gate, and whatever waited in it. But for one more moment, neither of them moved toward it. The core of the Thorne gate was a cathedral built by something that had never seen a knee bent in worship and had guessed at the concept. It opened above them all at once as they climbed the last span, a vast spherical chamber webbed with light, and at its center, suspended in nothing, a shape that made Carter's eyes water when he tried to look directly at it. It was not a weapon. He had been braced for a weapon, some enormous cannon aimed at the stars. Instead, it was a mechanism of impossible delicacy, all interlocking rings and turning seals, a thing built to hold, not to fire. And it was coming apart. "That's not right," Mila breathed, stopping at the chamber's edge. "Look at it. The seals. They're slipping." Carter followed her gaze and, being a person who fixed small, careful things for a living, understood at once what he was seeing, even if he didn't understand what it meant. A lock. An ancient, monstrous, straining lock, its outer rings grinding against each other, one seam gapping wider by the second, and behind that widening seam, pressure. Something on the other side, pushing. Something the size of a bad idea that had learned to breathe. They found the console the way you find bad news, all at once, and too late to unsee it. It rose from the chamber floor in a curl of the same black metal as everything else, its surface alive with slow Vaskari-like glyphs. "Older than Vaskari," Mila murmured. Older than her people had been a people. And as they approached, the glyphs rearranged themselves helpfully into meaning, the way the gate seemed able to do, as though it had been waiting a very long time for someone to come and read them. Mila read them. Carter watched her face do the thing faces do when they receive information they would have paid a great deal not to have. "The gate isn't a gateway," she said slowly. "We've had it wrong the whole war, all of us. It was never a door for us to hold open, or a weapon to be won. It's a lock, a seal. Something was imprisoned behind it, before humans, before Vaskari, before anyone we have names for. And the Ves," her jaw tightened. "The Ves don't want to come through it. They want to open it. They've been battering the seal from outside for years, trying to let out whatever's behind. Every battle we fought thinking we were defending a door, we were reinforcing a prison the enemy was trying to crack. And now it's cracking." "How do we uncrack it?" Carter asked, with the specific optimism of a man who suspects he won't like the answer. Mila's fingers moved over the glyphs. They rearranged. She went still. "From the inside," she said. "The seal can only be closed from in here, and whoever closes it—" She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Carter looked at the single console, at the widening seam, at the chamber that had no other door, and did the arithmetic, and hated it. "No," he said. "It's the only—" "You've been alone your whole life," Carter said, and his voice cracked and he let it. "You built yourself out of dead skin so you'd never have to feel anyone leave. And now you want to do the most alone thing there is in the whole universe and call it a sacrifice. That's not sacrifice, Mila. That's just the old habit wearing a hero's coat." She stared at him. He had never called her by her name before. It seemed to land somewhere the armor didn't cover. "It has to be done," she said, but quieter now. "Then we do it," he said. "Both of us. Show me how." She turned back to the console, hands moving, and then she stopped, and Carter watched the last cruelty of the thing arrive on her face. She read the final glyphs twice. "I can't," she whispered. "That's, of course it needs that." She laughed, that humorless laugh he'd learned to hate. "The seal isn't mechanical, it's empathic. It has to be closed by touch, a living, feeling touch, pressed into the core, holding it shut through the skin. It reads intent, like we do. It needs someone who can feel it closing, feel the seal answer, or it won't take." She held up her scarred, golden, mostly dead hands, and they were shaking. "And I can't. There isn't enough of me left that's awake. I spent it all. I spent it on purpose. I made myself into the one person in this room who cannot close it." The seam widened. Something behind it exhaled a cold that had opinions. And Carter, squire, boot polisher, teller of terrible jokes, holder of hands for his own sake, stepped up to the console beside her and pressed his own ordinary human hand flat against the core. It was warm. It hummed. And it did nothing, because he was not Vaskari, and the seal did not know how to listen to him. "It won't read me," he said, "but it'll read you." He reached out and took her scarred hand in his, and moved it to lie over his own against the core. And then he laid his other hand against the inside of her wrist, on that narrow band of gold that was still awake, still able to hear the thing his touch was saying. "You feel this," he said. "You feel me, and I'll feel it closing. We do it together, hand over hand. You're the one it listens to. I'm the one who can hear it answer. Neither of us can close this alone." He met her eyes. "So let's not." Mila looked at their tangled hands on the humming heart of the ancient lock. The seam yawned. The cold reached for them. And the untouchable warrior, who had spent a lifetime learning to feel nothing, chose to feel everything one last time on purpose, and pressed. What Carter felt, in the moment their joined hands pressed into the heart of the ancient lock, was not describable in any language he had, and he had a great many words. It came up through Mila's awake wrist and into his own skin like sound too low to hear, the seal answering, the vast mechanism recognizing at last a living touch and the intent behind it, and choosing, after uncounted years, to trust it. He felt the seam begin to close, and through his other hand, the one wrapped around Mila's scarred fingers, he felt her feel it too, because he was her ears now, and she was his voice, and between them they made one whole creature capable of doing the impossible thing that neither could do alone. The rings turned. The gap narrowed. Whatever had been pushing from the far side pushed harder, a cold and patient enormity that had waited a very long time and did not care to keep waiting. But the seal was empathic, and what it needed was not strength. It needed someone to mean it. And they meant it, hand over hand, Carter murmuring a running stream of encouragement to a machine older than his species. "Come on, nearly. You can do it, you enormous, beautiful, terrifying thing." Until the last seam ground shut with a sound like a planet clearing its throat, and the cold went away, and the light in the great chamber softened from the white of alarm to the deep blue of a thing at rest. The pressure was gone. The lock held. Whatever slept behind it went back to sleeping, sealed for another age it would never trouble. Carter and Mila stood there with their hands still joined on the core, breathing hard, entirely alive. "Huh," said Carter. "Huh," Mila repeated. "I had a whole speech, for if we died, it was very moving. It was mostly about porridge." "I'd have hated it," she said, and she was smiling. The real one, the young one the war had never been allowed to see. Getting out proved to be the gate's final joke. With the seal closed, the whole structure seemed to relax, and the walkways that had defied gravity remembered their manners, and a passage simply opened in the chamber wall where there had been no passage before, a long bright throat leading up and out, as though the machine, its ancient work finally shared, was politely showing its guests to the door. They climbed it together. Mila did not let go of his hand, and Carter, who had spent his whole small life being useful to people who never looked at him twice, understood that he was being looked at now, and would be for a long time, and found he could bear it. They came out into daylight through a seam in the black ring that closed behind them like a wound healing, and the plain of Thorne unrolled before them, and it was quiet. The vests were gone. When the seal shut, whatever hive will had driven them lost the thing it had been reaching for, and the tide had simply stopped, 10,000 bodies going still at once, then folding themselves into neat geometric stacks out of what looked, for a machine, uncomfortably like disappointment. The human line and the Vaskari line stood together across the wreckage, staring at the silence, not yet daring to believe it. And then someone saw the two figures walking out of the gate that had swallowed them, the lost squire and the vanished commander, dust-caked, bruised, absurdly, impossibly alive. And a sound went up across the plain that Carter would remember on his deathbed, whichever number of years old he turned out to be. Dylan reached him first, white as ever, and threw his arms around him with the abandon of a man who'd already delivered the eulogy. "You were dead. We had a service. I said things." Were they nice things? They were adequate things. There wasn't much material. The alliance that had been fraying for a year did not fray after that. It's difficult to keep two people suspicious of each other when the whole war has just watched a human boy and a Vaskari commander walk hand in hand out of the heart of the machine they'd all been dying for, having done together the one thing no one alone could do. The generals, who had wanted the gate as a weapon, learned instead that they had spent the war guarding a lock, and that the guarding had been worth doing after all, just not for the reason any of them had believed. The truth of it spread through both camps, and where there had been two lines standing warily shoulder to shoulder, there began, slowly, to be one. As for Mila, the scars did not vanish. That would have been a lie, and this was not a story that needed one. She carried them still, silver rivers across gold, the map of every touch she'd once refused to survive. But she stopped adding to them. She stopped picking the fights meant to leave more. The monster in the stories quietly went out of business, and in her place there was simply a woman, sharp-witted and long-scarred and slowly, deliberately relearning the enormous risk of letting people close, starting with the narrow bands of gold that were still awake, and one boy who had found them first without wanting anything at all. He had changed too, the boy who polished boots he couldn't wear. He wore his own now. Someone had seen to that. But more than the boots, Carter had stopped being the perpetually apologetic thing that flinched through camp expecting to be overlooked. He had held a hand for his own sake, and it had closed the door on an age of monsters. A person doesn't come back from that unchanged. He talked just as much, still, when he was frightened, and when he was alive. The difference was that now, at last, people leaned in to listen. They came for the armoring duty a few mornings later, the squires, gathering to draw the dreaded straws, and found Carter already ducking into the Golden Warrior's tent, no straw in hand, because it had somehow, without anyone quite voting on it, simply become his. Inside, Mila stood waiting in the blue light, half into the mesh, her back and its silver rivers turned toward the flap. "You're late, squire," she said. But she was smiling before she even turned around. He picked up the spine piece. His hands found the small, careful work, buckle by buckle, up the ribs, gentle at the seams. And when he fastened the strap along her side and his fingers brushed the place that was still awake, she laughed, bright and unguarded and entirely herself, and reached back, without armor between them, and took his hand and held it there where she could feel it, in front of the open tent flap, in front of anyone, unhurried and unafraid. The woman who had spoken to no one had, in the end, chosen to be known, and the boy who had polished boots in the dark got to spend the rest of a long and improbable life being the one who knew her. For a long time, Mila believed the safest way to survive loss was to stop being able to feel it. She burned the tenderness out of herself on purpose and called the scars a fortress. And she wasn't entirely wrong. The numbness worked. It kept the grief out. It just kept everything else out too. And one quiet morning she woke to find she'd become the monster in her own stories, having built the walls with her own two hands, buckle by buckle. It took a boy who wanted nothing from her to show her the thing she'd forgotten, that the parts of us capable of being hurt are the very same parts capable of holding another person at all. You cannot deaden one without deadening the other. To feel nothing is not to be safe. It's only to be already, quietly, gone. So here is what the story would ask of you before it lets you go. Think of the scars you've earned that you swore you'd never risk again. Think of the door you closed after something walked out of it, and how you told yourself the closing was wisdom. Ask yourself honestly whether it was protection or just an old habit wearing a hero's coat. And then think of the narrow places still awake in you, the ones that never got burned, the ones that still remember what a gentle hand feels like, and are waiting, patiently, for you to let someone find them. Because the untouchable warrior was never really untouchable. She was only unreached. And the difference between those two things, that is the whole of a life. Who right now is reaching for you? And whose hand have you been too afraid to take? The end. We've reached the end of another science fiction adventure, friends. Before we go, please hit the like button below and leave your thoughts on the story in the comments. We would be very happy if you did. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next story. Take care until the next one.